again, and I think now we will reconvene. Some new folks have joined us since the break, and for their benefit, I thought I would just again read the bit of Jim's paper from the 25th anniversary of the campus that got excised when the thing was finally published. The paper that he delivered was called The Myth of Rationality. It was a kind of full-throated kind of attack on economistic reasoning in the social sciences and a defense of ambiguity and the kinds of notions that we were occupying ourselves in the first part of this afternoon's convening. But it had this little bit in it, and this is by way of introducing part two. He said, "You will be spared the stories of the good old days when 40% of the Irvine student body was enrolled in a course on models in social science taught by faculty with a median number of years of teaching experience of 0. When the School of Social Sciences managed a commune on the campus, where visitors from Guatemala and Mexico puzzled over the strange cultural habits and bizarre farming techniques of California flower children. When each new year, the new faculty and students outnumbered the old, and each morning the campus police reported on the improprieties committed by the faculty and students over the night, and when the main issues were revolution, mathematics, and mud." The afternoon session is devoted to revolution, mathematics, and mud. But before I ask Donncha Kavanagh to come up and say his piece here from the University College Dublin, you all should know that among some of us faculty in the School of Social Sciences, like me, who came in the mid to late 90s, there's a couple of documents that have been sort of surreptitiously circulating among some of us, passed hand to hand, as we try to figure out what this place is and how we got here and what we're doing here. One of them is a dissertation by Johan Olsen, who studied the School of Social Sciences at its founding, and who wishes that he could be here, but unfortunately couldn't due to health and travel and all of that. He's in Norway. And we literally have like a couple Xerox copies of this thing upstairs in the dean's office that gets passed around. The other is the work by this guy, Donncha Kavanagh, and it's kind of amazing how his papers about the early history of the School of Social Sciences have circulated among some of us as we try to kind of figure out this place and the path dependencies that led to us being in it, doing the kind of things that he's describing happened years and years and years ago. He has interviewed, I think, several of the people in this room. He has also done follow-up research on the early history of the school and its place in the history of the social sciences and its place in the history of the organization of the university. So we're very pleased he could join us all the way from Dublin. Donncha, please come up.
Thank you very much, Bill, and thanks for having me here. It's really a great honour and a privilege. So I'm delighted to travel all the way from Dublin. Shani's just travelled back as well. So thanks, Shani, for all the help on the way. So I'm calling this deliberately different. So I studied this about 10 years ago, and I studied it because I was on sabbatical in UCSD. I knew Jeff Bowker, and I said I was interested in unusual organizations or unusual or deviant forms of organizations. Studying the School of Social Sciences, and Mike Cole was in UCSD, so my first interview was with Mike Cole, and the interviews progressed while I was here. And then I interviewed more people. I interviewed Kim Romney, more people when I went back home, and in some ways it stayed there. I wrote a couple of pieces, but personally I found it hugely enlightening, hugely interesting. I didn't really do an awful lot with it, but it did an awful lot for me. So some of the reasons, it is unusual, and that's really why it's worth studying. I think we should study the unusual, and it was unusual. And obviously Jim March was a hugely influential figure, and I think if you believe that theory, that context matters, but the context within which the theory develops also matters. So if we want to talk about theory, we have to talk about the context within which these theories develop. And it was unusual, as you just mentioned to him earlier, where you had a student of organizing and decision-making actually running and playing and experimenting with an organization. So it has this reflexive dimension, and the word reflexive, I suppose, wasn't in the language that much at the time, but it was certainly reflexive. You had people who were studying organizations and studying decision-making and living in organizations and making decisions. So it was interesting in that respect as well. It was also a deliberate attempt to foster the contrarian, and I suppose universities should, I wrote a piece once that the university is fool. Universities should be foolish. Universities should celebrate the contrarian, and this was an attempt to celebrate the contrarian, to do things that were contrary to the institution, within the institution, that confront the institutional powers. So that was an interesting and brave and somewhat reckless exercise. And it was an important site where various epistemological conflicts and struggles were played out. It was really at the cusp of the end of, well, at the peak, it's not the end by any means, but a new ethnomethodology developing, situated learning, more interpretivist approaches, and you had a strong mathematical modeling tradition. So a lot of that happened here. Those conflicts and those conversations, which were really interesting and illuminating, and a lot of strands developed out of there. And I remember when I interviewed Jim, he said, well, history is no lesson, or no, I forget what the phrase was, but it was, don't look to history to tell us how to lead the future. We won't learn much from history. But I think we can learn a lot about history. We can learn about other experiments and about how we might design educational practice and scholarship from looking at this set. So I had interviews with these people. By no means the full cohort of people, and I do apologize for, and mainly in this period, 2004 to 2009, I had correspondence with other people, and I went through the archival material, which is fascinating, all typewritten, and the level of thought that comes through, and the memos, and the letters, and the student voice is largely missing from my study, and it's great that John and Lynn are going to flesh that out. And I suppose there is a kind of a bias in that I've largely interviewed people who were academics, who've gone through an academic system, and are maybe successful, and look on the system have a particular take on it. So I didn't look at the marginalized people who maybe lost out, people who the system, who the experiment didn't really serve. And that's definitely a bias. Neither the students nor the staff, I think. I'm also, I was just talking to Bill's student, what's his name? He's going to come over, he's an anthropologist student, going to come over to Ireland to study ghost states. So we have anthropologists coming from Irvine over to Ireland, and I suppose Ireland has always been a destination for anthropologists, and so we were a bit sceptical always of anthropologists coming over and saying what we're like. And I'm equally sceptical, as in some senses the role is reversed here, is that I'm an anthropologist of Irvine. So I'm pretty sceptical myself of the practice that I'm involved in, and I well recognize that my particular interpretation is a very limited interpretation. I came from halfway across the world, so I'm kind of putting that caveat in at the very beginning. So it's what I've learned, and it might not necessarily resonate with your experiences, but there we are. And in terms of, this is an image I got from the archives from 1959. Now, I don't know how much, I didn't have much information on the image, but that was taken in 1959 in this space here somewhere. To give a sense of, I suppose, what life was like not that long ago. I presume that maybe it was staged, but certainly this was a farm. It was largely barren. There wasn't that many people here. It was radically different to what we have here now. radically, radically different. It's almost unimaginable. I think the Planet of the Apes was shot here this year. And in some sense that's quite ironic and relevant because it's almost a different planet, I'd say. And hence it's very difficult to understand maybe. And very briefly, the socio-political context of around that period was radically different to what we have here. We had a lot of protests about US foreign policy, the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, the feminist movement. Contraception was legalized in 1961. It took about another 30 years before it was legalized in Ireland, but there you go. And you had interest in all sorts of alternative ways of doing things. You had Marcuse, you had the Power Elite, you had Paul Goodman's work, you had the Essendon Institute, a lot of different experiments about and antagonisms and confrontations with traditions were all being articulated here in this general part of the globe. I think it's also important to remember that it was in a long tradition of this particular experiment was in the tradition of other experiments. It wasn't that new, really. It continued other experiments, and it's worth pointing out some of those. You had the Institute of Human Relations at Yale, and that lasted for about 21 years. And it was interdisciplinary, and now these were interdisciplinary in different ways. And the concept of interdisciplinarity, I think, is important. What does it actually mean? And it can be thrown around as a term, but I think it means different things in different contexts. So that was Yale, and Jim March graduated from Yale in 1953, but I have no clue as to the degree to which what was going on in Yale influenced him, so that we might try to find out a bit more about that. Mike Cole trained in Yale and moved to the school in 1996, and he was one of, I suppose, the key actors at that stage. So that's one. Then you had the Department of Social Relations at Harvard, which lasted about 20 years, and I think it was Kim Romney said to me that these things tend to last for about 20, 25 years. So there was a mix there of anthropology, psychology, sociology. And Kim trained there. Jean Labe was in Harvard as well, and I think Ollie Steffler was in Harvard as well. So there was a move. That Harvard interdisciplinary tradition also had an influence here. You had the Cowles Commission from 1939 to 1955, which again lasted about 16 years. And this was quite different insofar as it was economics, maths, and stats was the interdisciplinary nexus there. And most importantly, I suppose, was the Graduate School of Industrial Administration, which has been well studied and well researched. And it's quite interesting for me that that Irvine hasn't got a fraction of the study that GSIA has got. And Irvine really was, but perhaps an equally fascinating place. 30 to 50 men, and all these places were dominated by men. And I suppose one of the really interesting things about Irvine was the number of women, even though there wasn't a large number of women. But there was there was a woman.
More than one.
But in some of the other places, from my records, I don't think there was any female faculty member in some of the other places. So maybe that seems to be the case anyway. So the tradition there was interdisciplinary, quantitative modelling. And in many ways, this was a continuation of the GSIA experiment. And that lasted only about 10 years. That was falling apart around 1964. Lee Bach, who led it, was moving, and so Jim March had been there, and Julian Feldman had been a graduate student. They were the first two to come. So there was a clear link between GSIA and Irvine. And there was a wider interest in interdisciplinary quantitative modelling. And it was in various places in the National Academy of Science, the Social Science Research Council, the Institute for Advanced Studies, Center for Advanced Studies into Behavioral Science, and the RAND Corporation down the road. So there was this pretty wide appreciation for a particular way to study social phenomena, which was to use maths. Computers were beginning to come in, and there was a very strong interest in computing here in Irvine. But it was relatively small, and here's an extract from an interview with Jim. It's reflected the dominant beliefs of a dominant group of social behavioral scientists at the time. But it was a relatively small group, even though it was quite elitist and dominant. It wasn't that many. So now you probably can't see this particularly well, but this is an attempt to try to. I know there was a comment earlier on about the way in which that network, and of course this is I'm only trying to identify some individuals there, and I have colours for the different institutions. But there was quite a close network of relationships between different characters. And obviously it's not, it's an abbreviation. I won't go through it, but I'll just leave it there for a second for you to see that. And Jim March, of course, is right down in the bottom left, not in the centre by any means. And things followed on from that. And this was really just the quantitative, the mathematical modelling approach to studying social phenomena, that tradition. If you did some kind of network analysis, you'd probably find the links to Herb Simon were bigger than anybody else. But anyway, so that was so moving on to March. He was the dean, obviously, from 1964 to this shouldn't have actually come up. But there you go. So he obviously made contributions. He was a poet, he was an operations researcher, he was a teacher, a scholar, and right across all of it, it's quite amazing, without getting into some kind of hagiography, all the interviews, the adjectives that were used were quite remarkable. Brilliant, charismatic, exciting, strong individual, remarkable, playful, fun. These were the words that were used routinely. One of the nicest, most honourable men. Bonnie and Jim knew more about everything than any of us. And so it just went on and on. It was kind of almost embarrassing, I'm sure, to hear all this stuff. And it's interesting, I suppose, in terms of a tradition of decision-making. And this was, the title I get for this presentation was Deliberately Different. So it was deliberately different. There was a decision in some sense, or a decision in inverted commas. Because here's an extract from a letter that March wrote to the Vice Chancellor Hindraker in November 1963. This was before he arrived in Irvine, setting out that vision. So it was set out quite clearly. The social sciences division should be conspicuously experimental, which is what was picked up for the title for this. And the burden of proof should be shifted to the existing system. And major innovations with respect to curricula in the social sciences, instructional methods, academic organisation, staffing policies. And it should be viewed as an experimental laboratory rather than as primarily a production facility. And I think that's a great slogan for a university. It really is. And it's interesting, we've become, with massification, of course, we have a small number, and the numbers are really important, but we've massified education, and it has become primarily a production facility. So the idea of saying to students that, look, you're here on an experiment, it's a great way of I think bringing the students with you. So specialization should be problem areas rather than by traditional academic disciplines. So the disciplines, the academic departments and disciplines were seen as part of the problem. Faculty should have substantial disrespect for traditional disciplinary identifications. So it's going to be empirical. Social sciences should be heavily laced with mathematics, statistics, and computer methods. It has to take risks. And of course, if you're in a place where there's nobody really, you have to be different. You have to be, you have to make. You can't just replicate what's there already. So it's going to be risky. And here's March being interviewed in 1973. I had the instincts of having studied organizations, it'd be fun to build one. So it was the instincts of a missionary with respect to social science. Go to the next one. So very quickly, just going through and running out of time probably. So 64 people were hired, 65 you had 15 faculty hired, 66 more faculty were hired, all junior, practically all junior, and it was the average teaching experience was probably 0, right? And more faculty hired. So, like, you're starting from base 0. It is really, it wasn't a greenfield site, it's a brownfield site, instead, given the climate. Unusually, all faculty, including non-academic staff and student representatives, were involved in the hiring process. So you Bill Sharp, Jean Lave, Mike Cole, Joanne Bell, apparently Garfinkel was hired twice, and sacked, I think, twice. I'm not too sure. So there was an idea, in some senses, well, maybe it wasn't let many flowers bloom, but it certainly was, if people had interesting ideas, we should hire them. And in some ways, it doesn't really make, even though there was this idea to have a mathematical modelling centre to it, if people weren't in that mathematical modelling tradition, well, but they were interesting, let's bring them in. So there was a deliberate attempt to have diversity. And this was Harvey. Harvey Sachs was part of this. This was Willie Schoenfeld, remembering one discussion about, well, who do we hire? But there was a deliberate view, well, we need to hire different people. We can't hire people who are the same as ourselves. We want to have variety. We must have variety. And it was part of a strong, I suppose, systemic tradition at the time. So there was a mention of the maths and stats, equivalent to 45 European, should change that, equivalent to 45 ECTS credits over the first 3 years. Effectively about a quarter of the course. I'll show it to you in a second, the curriculum. So there was this course, based on this book, or the book came out of it, An Introduction to Models in the Social Sciences, which is a great book. And that, in many ways, was the centerpiece of the first year of the program. And this was the extract from the catalogue. And the education is complete, the course is complete. There wasn't that much interest in graduate education, because obviously the undergraduates are coming through, essentially. Here's the curriculum from 1965-66, and you can see the way in which maths was interlaced through the whole thing. The idea was to be able to attract the engineers and scientists who were good mathematically away from engineering and science. And that, frankly, didn't really work. They didn't get that. The engineers, the quantitatively adept, didn't come in the numbers that were hoped for. And the numbers game started to play out, in my view, a number of years later, when it appeared that the sufficient numbers weren't there. But there was massive educational innovation. And reading through the archives in particular, and the reports and the discussion documents about different forms of learning, of assessment, of program design, like, you could feel the energy, and these were all hand-typed up stuff. You were at the farm school, at the development of it, which was really, and you have some stuff in that. And it wasn't, the graduate school, when you had to get a few faculty together, and they taught you how to PhD, well, in terms of, there was a part of speaking to the various people, one of the key things was an abhorrence of departmentalization, an abhorrence of structure, of formal structure. So there was various ways of creating structures temporarily and then letting them disappear, different models of having structure but breaking structure as well. And eventually, I suppose, and a number of people came, that the structure kind of emerged. So you had a program A, which was to do with formal models and mathematical modeling. A program B, which was more to do with, I suppose, anthropology, social psychology, psychology, sociology. And then you had subgroups developing in this. And this was quite flexible, though. It moved from, but people, in particular the program B people, make a lot of play about the program B. And program C was kind of the null set of those people who didn't believe in the idea of having a program A. And there was other groupings. And interestingly, the attempt to have diversity was facilitated by the accounting procedures and the accounting practices about how do you divide the money up between the groups so that and it was also facilitated, I think, very much by the architecture and the kind of water cooler effect of having spaces and moving people around from different offices, and architecturally reflecting the ideas of diversity and difference in the spaces. And one thing there was a mention of the Commune, and for me the Commune, I think a very nice study would be a kind of group dynamic study of what was going on, if that could be possible. But in some sense the Commune for me was a reflection and a projection of the organisation. It seemed to have many of the attributes of the organisation that it wanted, or that the organisation wanted or didn't want. But an even more interesting study would perhaps be a study of the Commune, what was going on in the Commune. And it's very difficult to find out information on the Commune.
I'm curious if anybody in the room was in that picture.
Well, Kathy and I are trying to decide that, because we both lived on the farm.
So you,
We're not in there.
But I don't think we're in there. We
I
want
don't even remember that.
No, sorry, that's not the Commune. That's a photo fit from.
Yeah.
Because there's no record really. There's no record of the Commune. That's not.
We can invent it. That's why we don't remember that in the
So. No, and I was wondering, should I put this in? But like I said, I put it in anyway. Because it is easy to romanticize what was going on. And everything was honky-dory, but maybe I won't keep that too long.
I don't know if anyone identifies himself in
Screen, not screen.
And I remember when I was interviewing Jim, I asked him, I was talking about the Commune.
multiple times.
F went to prison for raping his patient as a therapist, eventually.
Who did?
Remember F?
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, after he got fired from UCI, he then ended up going to prison for raping his patient.
Next slide.
I'll move on.
I want to say, I don't like these things because that person was the only person here on that list who deserves to have lots of negative attributions. All of the others had some problems in their behavior, but also wonderful human beings. And so I don't like having the criminal being put in with the good people.
But Mike, be fair, that was the person who introduced the idea of learning by doing.
Moving on from the disruptions. So somebody just, in terms of finishing it up at around 1969, so there was the wider community, which was a very, I suppose, conservative community, wasn't really tolerant of the goings-on in the university. Of course, Clark Kerr was fired by Robert Reagan. Clark Kerr being Ronald Reagan. Clark Kerr being the president of the University of California system for not clamping down on the students. Of course, he had a great comment about he started the job as he left it, fired with enthusiasm. Kerr. So, and coming through from the interviews, there were many faculty who were socially and politically conservative, and they were in an academic. They were very concerned about academic progression. So even though there was quite a lot of going on in the outside, they were in some sense quite. Some were seen as irresponsible, and there was, but only some. And the tenure reviews did seem to be an issue in '68 from the interviews, where people had been, I suppose, encouraged and advised to do things differently and to break disciplinary boundaries. And if you said, well, I'm not going to publish in the journal because the journal is part of the disciplinary boundaries, but then you go for a tenure review and people are coming in from outside, from San Francisco or whatever, and they're saying, well, where's your publications? And so around '68, I think, was a difficult time. And supply and demand, the students, as they came out, they graduated in program A or program B, and they went for a job or they went to graduate school, and people were saying, what's this? So that was okay when there wasn't, when there was plenty jobs about the place, but as jobs became more difficult to get for academics and for students, that put pressure on the experiment as well. I think also the golden age of interdisciplinarity was beginning to end in the mid-1960s. And I think it's worth a study on the notion of interdisciplinarity would be of interest. There was growing suspicion of big science, of mathematical modelling, of systems analysis and those approaches. And Marsh left in 1969, and that was clearly a huge event for the group, the kind of father figure that left. The program of social ecology splits off in 1970, and in many senses, I suppose the experiment did end, and there was, I do think there was a sense of disappointment and certain resentment and loss during the 70s as a result of all of that. But just to end, this was Mark's memo. I hope things continue to be unstable enough, so the leader was